Hi everyone, this is Anne from Lolli and Grace, and this tutorial is all about how to separate strands of embroidery thread. And the kind of thread we're talking about here is this very wonderful DMC thread. It's sometimes referred to as six-stranded cotton thread because it is made up of multiple strands of thread. Not all thread that you would stitch with is something that you would need to separate, pearl thread for instance, but most commonly this is probably what you're going to be using, and one of the most repetitive things you're going to do is to separate strands of thread unless you're only stitching with six strands, which is unlikely. So before we get into the hows and the whys, let me tell you that learning how to strip embroidery threads to separate them was one of the most revolutionary things for my stitching. And that sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I promise I'm not. So previously, when I first started stitching, let's say I needed 3 strands of thread. I'm going to start on this end. So I would just grab 3 and 3 and just pull them apart. Okay, well that drove me nuts because you had to go really slow. You had to keep them separated as you went down the strand of thread. When you got them apart, they both spun around and retwisted. Then when I was stitching, I could not figure out why my stitches were ropey and didn't lay smooth and knotted up a lot, and I just was constantly frustrated. I just couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. When I learned about how to strip threads, my stitching changed drastically and it was much more enjoyable. Just the act of separating the strands became much more enjoyable because I just did not like that, how everything knotted and twisted back up on itself. And the actual stitching changed as well. So here is how to strip embroidery threads. It sounds violent, but I promise it's not. So again, let's say you wanted 3 strands of thread. So if you sort of tease these apart, you can see the multiple strands. Get really close for you right there. But I'm not going to pull out 3. I am going to pull out 1 strand at a time. Regardless of how many strands you need, you're always going to only pull 1 strand at a time. So I am going to find one and start pulling it. I'm holding it loosely between these fingers of this hand. And then I am going to carefully just pull that 1 strand up, and you can see, I'll keep pulling, how those other threads are all sort of spiraling up on each other. Now you may be thinking to yourself, that is going to be one knotted mess that's going to be a disaster. But I promise it's not. If I keep pulling, well, see how that all sprung apart and it just kind of went back to a long length of thread? It looks a little messy, but all I have to do now is take these fingers and I just run these fingers down and kind of realign those threads. And now they're back ready for the next one. So let me put that aside for a moment. So when I've pulled my 1 thread out, I am going to lay it on my table. Let me back up here and say that this is a 36-inch length of thread. That is generally what I stitch with. That might be a little bit long for some of you. And that's okay. If you want to cut them in 18-inch lengths or 24-inch lengths, that's fine too. Obviously, this technique works with any length of thread. If you get too long, like 42 inches or longer, it can get a little tricky. So that's why I generally stick to 36 inches or shorter. So anyway, I've pulled that 1 strand out. Now I will lay it on my table like this. And I'll lay it out so I can see the end of it, like right here. All right, so that's my first strand. I'll come back to my 5 strands that are left. I'll do the same thing again. So I'm going to hold, sort of very lightly pinch with these 2 fingers. I'm going to pull 1 strand and very gently pull it up and out of the other strands that are there. I will hold on to that and realign those strands so that they, if you don't, after you pull one out, and if you don't really kind of run your fingers down, it can get a little knotted. So that's why I always just quickly run my fingers down. I'll take this second one that I've pulled out, make sure it's straight, and I will now line it up on my table next to that one. I'm going to do this a third time. Now, I've been going really, really slowly, and you do not actually have to go that slow. You can zip these out of here really pretty quickly. As long as you just sort of keep a feel for what's happening down here, as long as sometimes I'll pull it out and it will kind of snag, and I'll get a little bit of a knot down here in the threads that are twisting up underneath. If that's so, I just stop for a minute and kind of tease it apart. But if you see, hopefully you can see, I'm going really pretty fast. So there's my other ones. I'm going to put those aside. Here's the one that I just pulled out. I'm going to lay it on my table now. So now, if I wanted 3 strands, these 3 are ready to go. So I'll pick up this one, and that one, and that one. Generally line up the ends, hold them like that. And now to sort of recombine these, I will, same thing, I've recombined them. I'm holding them up pretty tightly up here with these fingers, and now I'm going to just run my hands, run the thread between all of these fingers. You can see they're a little bit down here. I'll just run my fingers down so that all those threads are now lined up. And now I think you can see, hopefully right there, you can see how smooth those threads are. They are laying parallel to each other now instead of being twisted together in a rope. What this means now for my stitching is it does mean fewer knots. It also means that now when I put down stitch after stitch, those strands will lay next to each other. They will be parallel to each other instead of twisted together or one laying on top of each other. So now they're much more likely to be smooth when you make a stitch. Maybe you can see that. Can you see that? All right. So that's why when you're stitching, it makes for nicer stitches. So not only does it make the process of separating the strands more pleasant, it makes a huge difference in your stitching and how your stitching looks. This is particularly important in a stitch like satin stitch, where it's really important that you want all the strands to lay smoothly next to each other. You don't want a rope of thread and a rope of thread and a rope of thread for each stitch. You want all of the strands to lay down smooth, so you get that kind of satiny finish. So that is the very basic but very important technique of how to separate strands of thread for your embroidery. All right, happy stitching, you guys!